In the early 1990s, a file was opened in the deep corridors of the Kremlin. A single word was written on it: Yeltsin. This file was one of the most secret documents of Soviet intelligence. Inside, there were hundreds of pages of information about Yeltsin's past, his habits, and his private life. But one day, that file suddenly disappeared. Some say it was destroyed on Yeltsin's orders. Others say it's still locked in a safe in the Kremlin secret archives. So what was in that file? And why did a leader want his own past to remain so secret? Tonight, we're uncovering the Kremlin's darkest secret. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more content, please don't forget to subscribe. Now let's get back to the story. Boris Yeltsin's name is associated with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But very few people know that his story began in 1931 in a small village in the Sverdlovsk region on a winter day when the cold froze your bones. The Yeltsin family was an ordinary working-class family that experienced the harshest winds of social change brought by the revolution. His father was the son of a peasant who was labeled a kulak and sent into exile. He was one of the first victims of the Soviet system. His mother was a quiet, resilient woman who knew how to survive. Boris spent his childhood in poverty. But poverty could not crush him. On the contrary, something began to awaken inside him. A resistance, a rebellious spirit. Yeltsin realized very early that the only way to survive was to learn the rules of the system and turn them in his favor. But an incident he experienced when he was only 9 years old laid the foundations of his personality. He found a hand grenade. Unable to resist his curiosity, he detonated it. He lost 2 fingers on his right hand. This incident was the first sign of his future bold but also dangerous decisions. Yeltsin was someone who liked to take risks, and this trait would both elevate him and nearly destroy him. As Yeltsin grew up, he delved deeper into the system. In the 1950s, he studied civil engineering at the Ural Polytechnic Institute. There he first got close to the Communist Party. But Yeltsin's loyalty to the party was not ideological, but strategic. He knew that the party card would give him power. And he was right. He joined the Communist Party in 1961. In his early years, he was a quiet, compliant member. But his eyes were always looking up. While working on construction projects in Sverdlovsk, his talents began to attract attention. He was fast, impressive, and results-oriented. In 1976, he was appointed head of the Sverdlovsk Regional Committee. This was a big leap for him. But the real leap came in 1985 when Mikhail Gorbachev called him to Moscow. Gorbachev appointed Yeltsin as the head of the Moscow Communist Party Committee. This position brought Yeltsin to the center of the Kremlin. Now the spotlight was on him, and he knew very well how to take advantage of that spotlight. In Moscow, Yeltsin quickly transformed into a reformist figure. He was a leader who spoke directly to the people, talked to ordinary people on the metro, and waited in line at the market. This image was almost revolutionary for the Soviet people, because leaders were distant, untouchable. But Yeltsin was different. He was on the street. He was among the people, and this made him beloved. But at the same time, it angered the old guard of the Kremlin. Yeltsin's rise pushed the limits that the system accepted. In 1987, at a Central Committee meeting, he criticized Gorbachev and the slowness of his reform process. This move was unprecedented insolence in Soviet politics. Yeltsin was immediately removed from his position. But this fall was not his end. It was the beginning of his rebirth. Because Yeltsin was now perceived as a victim, a martyr. And people love victims. In 1989, Yeltsin was elected to the Supreme Soviet from Moscow with an overwhelming majority. In 1990, he became chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Federation. He was no longer just an opposition figure. He was a power. And that power was in direct conflict with Gorbachev's power. While Gorbachev was trying to save the Soviet Union, Yeltsin was accelerating its collapse. The struggle between the two was cold but deadly. Yeltsin began direct dialogue with the republics seeking independence. He undermined Gorbachev's authority. But the real blow came during the August 1991 coup. Hardline communists tried to bring back the old system by removing Gorbachev from office. Tanks filled the streets of Moscow. And right at that moment, Yeltsin made a move that would go down in history. He climbed onto a tank. He addressed the people with a megaphone. He called for resistance against the coup. That image became the end, not only of the Soviet Union, but of an entire era. Yeltsin was no longer just a leader. He was a symbol. The coup failed. Gorbachev returned to power, but was now a ghost. The real power was with Yeltsin. In December 1991, Yeltsin met with the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus. They signed the Belavisa Agreement. This agreement declared the official end of the Soviet Union. The rug had been pulled out from under Gorbachev. On December 25, 1991, the red flag was lowered from the Kremlin. The 69-year history of the Soviet Union came to an end. Yeltsin became the first president of the new Russian Federation. But the victory was sweet and fleeting, because Yeltsin faced a much greater challenge ahead, governing Russia. And that Russia was chaotic, broken, hungry, and angry. Yeltsin's early years were disaster years for Russia. The economy collapsed. Inflation exceeded 1,000%. People didn't receive their salaries. Pensioners fell to the hunger line. Crime rates soared. Oligarchs plundered state property. Yeltsin implemented a radical economic reform program called shock therapy. This program was a sudden transition from a controlled economy to a free market economy. But there was no preparation. Institutions were weak. The result was complete chaos. Yeltsin began to transform from a hero to an enemy in the eyes of the people. But worse, his political rivals were getting stronger. In 1993, he had a serious conflict with parliament. Conservative and communist deputies resisted Yeltsin's reforms. The conflict heated up so much that in October 1993, Yeltsin ordered the army. Tanks bombarded parliament. Hundreds of people died. This event showed how fragile Russia's new democracy was. Yeltsin was sliding into authoritarianism. But frankly, whether he had any other choice is still debatable. In the midst of this chaos, the KGB file came back on the agenda. Because what was behind Yeltsin behaving so radically, so unpredictably? Some thought that dark secrets from his past were creating pressure. The KGB had monitored Yeltsin for years. Every step, every conversation, every weakness was recorded. Yeltsin's alcohol problem was one of the most referenced topics in the KGB's files. But it wasn't just alcohol. Yeltsin's private life, his relationships with women, his conflicts with his family, everything was on record. In the 1980s, when he was in Sverdlovsk, there were reports that Yeltsin had connections with some suspicious businessmen. These reports were never made public. But the KGB knew everything. And Yeltsin knew that too. And this knowledge frightened him when he came to power in 1991. One of Yeltsin's first actions was to dismantle the KGB. But in reality, the KGB was never completely dismantled. It was just restructured. It took the name FSB. Yeltsin tried to give control of this new structure to his own men. But the old KGB networks were strong. And the files about Yeltsin's past were still in someone's hands. In 1994, some sources in the Kremlin claimed that Yeltsin had set up a special team. The task of this team was to scan the old KGB archives and eliminate every document related to Yeltsin. It is said that some documents were burned. Some were locked in a deep safe. But nobody knows exactly what was found. For those who know are not talking. The 1996 elections were an existential threat to Yeltsin. Communist Party leader Gennady Zhuganov was a serious rival. Polls showed that Yeltsin was losing. And losing was not just a political end for Yeltsin. It was a personal end. Because if the opposition came to power, they would demand a reckoning with the past. Old files would be opened. Yeltsin couldn't take that risk. And he didn't. During the election campaign, Yeltsin's team used all the tools. The media was completely under Yeltsin's control. Oligarchs poured millions into the campaign. And most importantly, the West gave support. The Clinton administration was openly in favor of Yeltsin. In the end, Yeltsin won the election. But this victory was a victory with a heavy price. His health was poor. His heart was weakening. And mentally, he was not what he used to be either. During Yeltsin's second term, Russia increasingly slipped out of his control. The oligarchs took over the state. Names like Boris Berezovsky, Vladimir Guzinsky, Mikhail Khodorkovsky became the real owners of the country. Yeltsin was now no different from a puppet. He was frequently hospitalized. He appeared drunk at public sessions. Once, during a visit to Germany, he took the baton from the conductor's hand and tried to conduct the orchestra. The international press mocked him. But this mockery became a symbol of Yeltsin's tragedy. The man who once stood on top of a tank now had difficulty standing on his feet. In 1999, Yeltsin made one of the most surprising decisions in history. He resigned. But before resigning, he determined who would replace him. Vladimir Putin. Yeltsin had met Putin as the head of the FSB. He was a young, disciplined, determined man. And most importantly, his past was in the KGB. Yeltsin believed that Putin would protect him. And he was right. As soon as Putin took office, he gave Yeltsin and his family full immunity. There would be no investigations. There would be no lawsuits. Yeltsin could retire comfortably. And he did just that. On the afternoon of December 31st, 1999, he gave a brief speech at the Kremlin. "I'm tired," he said. "Russia needs a young, strong leader to carry it into the new century." And he left. He never returned to the political stage. Yeltsin's final years passed in silence. He lived in a private residence in Moscow. He was rarely seen. He rarely spoke. He died in 2007. His funeral was the first state funeral of post-Soviet Russia. Putin gave a speech. But interestingly, in his speech, he talked more about Yeltsin's courageous leadership than his democratic legacy. Yeltsin's legacy is controversial in Russia today. Some see him as a hero who liberated Russia. Some define him as a disaster who plundered and weakened Russia. But everyone agrees on one thing. Yeltsin was a complex figure, and his story cannot be explained by a simple bad or good distinction. So what about that file? That secret KGB file? Did it really exist? Or was it just a legend? The truth is the KGB monitored everyone, especially those in positions of power like Yeltsin. In the Soviet system, nothing went unrecorded. There is no doubt that Yeltsin had a file. But what exactly was in that file is still unclear today. Some former KGB agents claim that Yeltsin was involved in some corruption in the 1980s. There are rumors that he took bribes in construction projects in Sverdlovsk. But no concrete evidence has emerged. Some sources refer to more personal matters. Yeltsin's extramarital affairs, the extent of his alcohol addiction, even some periods of mental breakdown. But these are also speculation. But one thing is certain, Yeltsin was afraid of that file. And he knew how to use that fear as a political weapon. When he dismantled the KGB, he didn't just do it to destroy the old system. He also did it to clean up his own past. Documents in the archives were burned. Some agents were silenced. Some files disappeared. A few people in Yeltsin's inner circle say they were aware of these operations. But there is no proof. Everything remained in the dark, just like the Kremlin itself. Today, it is believed that there are still files related to Yeltsin in the FSB archives. But access to these files is strictly prohibited. With the Putin era, old Soviet-era documents came under tighter control. It became almost impossible for historians and journalists to access these documents. The documents kept in the secret safes of the Kremlin will probably never see the light of day again. Or after a very long time, perhaps when Russia has completely changed, those documents will be revealed. Until then, Yeltsin's secrets will continue to echo within the walls of the Kremlin. Yeltsin's story is a story of power, fear, and survival. It is a story of how a man fought against a giant system and eventually brought down that system. But it is also the story of how that man fought with his own inner world, with his own past. Because Yeltsin, seen from the outside, is a strong, brave, charismatic leader. But seen from the inside, he is a fragile, frightened, suspicious person. The KGB file is a symbol of this inner conflict. Whether that file is real or legend no longer matters. What matters is that Yeltsin believed in the existence of that file, and that this affected his every decision, every move. Today in Russia, Yeltsin's name is remembered with contradiction. The massive Yeltsin Center was opened in Ekaterinburg in his memory. But at the same time, many Russians hate him. Because Yeltsin's era is a period of loss and pain. People lost their jobs. They lost their savings. They lost their hopes. Yeltsin promised them freedom, but what they got was chaos. And now, under Putin's authoritarianism, many Russians are thinking, maybe freedom was too expensive for us. Maybe a strong hand is better than chaos. This way of thinking shows how complex Yeltsin's legacy is, because he tried to bring democracy to Russia. But at the same time, he was also an example of how democracy could fail in Russia. In conclusion, Yeltsin's story is one of history's great ironies. The man who brought down the Soviet Union was crushed under the system he created. The man who tried to liberate people eventually paved the way for the dominance of oligarchs and corruption. And the man who tried to protect himself remained a controversial figure in the pages of history. The KGB file is the final symbol of this irony, because Yeltsin, despite all his power, could not escape his past. Whether that file exists or not, it always stood over him like a shadow. And perhaps this is Yeltsin's greatest tragedy. He brought down an empire, but never brought down the fears inside himself. In the deep corridors of the Kremlin, perhaps that file is still somewhere. On a dusty shelf, in a dark safe, at the very bottom of a forgotten archive. Inside are all the weaknesses, all the mistakes, all the secrets of a man. But now no one will open it, because some secrets are buried with the grave. And Yeltsin's secrets were buried like that too. But his legacy still lives on in the streets, in the politics, in the soul of Russia. And perhaps the real issue is this, not what that file was, but how that file shaped a man, and how that man shaped a country. Tonight, we took a journey through the dark corridors of the Kremlin. We discovered Boris Yeltsin's story, his power, his fears, and his secrets. We saw that history is not black and white. Heroes are not perfect, and bad guys are not always completely bad. Yeltsin was both hero and disaster, both savior and destroyer. And perhaps that's what makes him so interesting, because he embodied all the contradictions, all the complexity of humanity. Now, until we meet in the next video, if you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe, because the Kremlin has many more secrets, and we will continue to uncover them one by one.